Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent is publicly celebrating what he describes as a pivotal moment in American diplomacy. According to him, the United States has just narrowly avoided descending into a catastrophic trade confrontation with China, one that could have seen tariffs skyrocket to an unprecedented 100%. His message to the nation: crisis averted, victory secured. But if you take a step back from the press conferences and carefully examine what's actually on the table, a different picture begins to emerge. This isn't necessarily the triumph Washington wants you to believe it is. In fact, it might be something far more concerning, a signal that America's economic position is weaker than officials are willing to admit. The administration insists that a meaningful agreement has been reached, one capable of rebalancing the relationship between the world's two largest economic powers. Yet when you dig into the specifics, that so-called framework appears to rest on remarkably unstable foundations. It revolves around just three core components: import duties, agricultural exports, specifically soybeans, and access to rare earth minerals. Each of these elements will play a critical role in determining which nation truly controls the leverage in this high-stakes negotiation. While financial markets respond positively, and Bessent basks in the glow of apparent success, serious concerns are beginning to surface. What concessions did the United States actually make behind closed doors to secure this arrangement? And more importantly, can this fragile agreement genuinely shield an American economy already buckling under the weight of persistent inflation, escalating consumer prices, and mounting national debt? Let's break down what's really happening here, and why this moment might matter more than anyone realizes. Scott Bessent has gone on record stating that the United States has achieved what he calls a very substantial framework with Beijing, an understanding that supposedly stops a destructive 100% tariff escalation dead in its tracks. In his own words during a recent public appearance, he explained, "President Trump gave me tremendous negotiating power by threatening those 100% tariffs set to take effect on November 1st. I genuinely believe we've now arrived at a framework that's significant enough to prevent that outcome. We're going to discuss substantial purchases of soybeans and eggs from American farmers. We're going to work toward more balanced trade between our two nations." On the surface, this narrative sounds like a diplomatic breakthrough. The United States sidesteps a tariff catastrophe. American farmers, who have been devastated by Beijing's trade policies, finally get some relief. And the trade imbalance that has dominated political discourse for years appears to be moving toward resolution. But here's where things get complicated. What exactly did Washington sacrifice to reach this point of supposed calm? This framework Bessent keeps referencing isn't a comprehensive trade treaty. It's not even a formal agreement in the traditional sense. What we're looking at is a provisional understanding, a temporary arrangement built around three specific pillars, each one carrying significant risks. The first pillar involves tariffs themselves. President Trump's explicit threat to impose an additional 100% duty on Chinese imports created enough pressure to bring negotiators from both sides back to the table. It was a calculated gamble designed to force Beijing's hand. The second pillar centers on America's agricultural sector, which has been hemorrhaging money. China had effectively reduced its purchases of American soybeans to virtually nothing, leaving American farmers in financial freefall. This forced the administration to promise new subsidy packages while simultaneously pushing Beijing to resume imports. The third pillar, and perhaps the most strategically critical, involves rare earth elements. These are specialized minerals essential for manufacturing everything from consumer electronics like smartphones to advanced military hardware like fighter jets. The United States has been lobbying China to postpone its newly announced export restrictions on these materials for at least 12 months, hoping to avoid immediate supply chain disruptions. According to Bessent's public statements, Beijing has tentatively agreed to both conditions. They'll start purchasing American soybeans again, and they'll delay implementing stricter controls on rare earth exports. In exchange, President Trump has committed to shelving his 100% tariff threat. If you take this at face value, it looks like Washington scored a clean diplomatic victory, a moment of clarity after months of economic turbulence. But here's the problem. The actual details of this arrangement remain classified. No one outside a small circle of officials knows what the United States promised in return. The public doesn't know what was traded away to secure these commitments. Bessent's confident public demeanor might temporarily reassure investors and stabilize markets. But underneath that calm exterior, there's a growing sense of unease among economists and policy analysts. The American economy isn't in good shape. Inflation continues to erode purchasing power. Consumer debt is climbing, and ordinary citizens are running out of patience with rising costs. The critical question isn't whether this framework exists, it's whether it can withstand real economic pressure when tested. And that test is coming sooner than most people think. While officials celebrate diplomatic progress, the domestic economic reality tells a much darker story. The American economy isn't just slowing down, it's showing structural cracks that can't be ignored any longer. Consumer sentiment has dropped to its lowest level in 5 months, and when you look at current conditions specifically, they've fallen to multi-year lows. These aren't abstract statistics. They reflect how real people feel about their financial security right now. Even more concerning, inflation expectations have climbed again, from 3.7% to 3.9% for the next 5 to 10 years. This shift in expectations reveals something deeply troubling. Ordinary Americans no longer believe prices will ever return to what they consider normal levels. They've accepted that higher costs are permanent. Affordability has regressed to where it was in 2022, the year when the cost of living crisis first erupted into national consciousness. Everyday Americans are feeling the pressure intensely. Groceries, housing costs, transportation expenses, all of them are rising faster than wages can keep pace with, and that pressure isn't isolated to one sector, it's spreading across the entire economy. The ongoing tariff conflict only accelerates this deterioration. While these trade barriers do inflict damage on Chinese exporters, they also drive prices higher for American consumers. The United States still imports more than $1 billion worth of Chinese goods every single day. If tariffs on those imports were to double, retail prices across the country would surge uncontrollably, pushing inflation into territory that would be nearly impossible to manage. The United States operates as a consumption-driven economy. When prices spike, consumer spending contracts and confidence evaporates. Recent data already shows people pulling back on major purchases: cars, appliances, home improvements. Savings accounts are being depleted at an alarming rate. Manufacturing sectors are feeling the strain as well. Imported industrial components and raw materials are becoming more expensive, which drives up production costs for American manufacturers. This creates a self-reinforcing cycle. Higher input costs lead to higher consumer prices, which reduce demand, which then forces businesses to cut costs, often through layoffs. Behind all the political theater and tough talk about tariff threats, there's a simple economic truth that can't be avoided. The United States cannot dramatically increase prices on everything it imports without inflicting serious damage on its own economy. Each new round of tariffs chips away at consumer confidence and pushes inflation expectations even higher. This mounting economic pressure is precisely why Washington is so desperate to preserve the current framework agreement. Officials understand that the longer this trade conflict drags on, the more vulnerable the American economy becomes. Every month that passes without resolution increases the risk of something breaking, whether that's consumer spending, business investment, or financial markets. Meanwhile, Beijing finds itself in a fundamentally different position. While Washington faces domestic pressure, China has significantly more room to maneuver strategically. The portion of Chinese exports destined for the United States is substantial, yes, but it's nowhere near economically crippling. Global demand for Chinese manufactured goods continues to grow across multiple markets. Over the past 12 months, China's total exports have approached $4 trillion. Even in a hypothetical scenario where trade with the United States stopped completely, that loss would represent only about 2.5% of China's gross domestic product, possibly even less given current economic conditions. For Beijing, this means they can afford to play a long game of endurance. For Washington, it means the pressure to resolve this quickly is mounting every single day. Scott Bessent has expressed confidence that China will soon resume purchasing American soybeans, describing this development as major relief for farmers across the Midwest who have suffered tremendous losses. During one interview, Bessent even revealed a personal connection to the issue. "I'm actually a soybean farmer myself, so I've felt this pain too." There are a couple of things happening here. One, the Chinese have substantially dropped their purchases to almost zero. Unfortunately, they've been using American farmers, who are among President Trump's biggest supporters, as leverage. I believe when the announcement of the deal with China is made public, our soybean farmers will feel very good. His tone might sound optimistic, almost casual. But for the farmers living through this crisis, there's nothing lighthearted about it. United States soybean exports to China have already collapsed to zero, leaving storage facilities overflowing and farms teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. Even during the intense trade war of 2018 and 2019, China still purchased approximately 1.5 million tons of American soybeans annually. Today, that flow of trade has been completely severed. The Trump administration has already committed to a $10 billion bailout package specifically designed to prevent mass bankruptcies across the agricultural sector. But government subsidies can only mask the damage for so long. They're a temporary bandage, not a permanent solution. Bessent's entire strategy depends on Beijing reversing its current policy. For that reversal to happen, China would need to eliminate its 10% tariff on American soybeans, effectively removing approximately $12 billion worth of trade levies. That's not a trivial decision from Beijing's perspective. Making that choice would require China to reduce imports from Brazil and Argentina, the two countries that have now become dominant suppliers of soybeans to the Chinese market. Brazil alone has transformed into China's primary agricultural partner, currently supplying more than 70% of China's total soybean imports. If Beijing does decide to return to purchasing American soybeans, it won't be an act of generosity or goodwill. It will be a calculated strategic move designed to extract concessions elsewhere, perhaps in technology transfer agreements, financial market access, or relaxed export control regulations. There's also a pure economics component to consider. American soybeans for October delivery were priced roughly $90 per ton cheaper than Brazilian soybeans, a discount of approximately 1 to 2%. In the world of bulk commodity trading, that price difference adds up quickly when you're talking about millions of tons. However, even with that natural price advantage, China's 10% import tariff keeps American soybeans uncompetitive in the Chinese market. Removing that tariff would effectively eliminate levies on approximately $12 billion of American agricultural goods. A short-term resumption of trade might create the appearance of a diplomatic victory for Washington in the headlines. But it could easily mask deeper concessions that were made behind closed doors. Concessions the public won't learn about until much later, if ever. For now, the mere hope of renewed Chinese demand is what's keeping many American farmers financially afloat. If those purchases don't materialize quickly, the soybean comeback that Bessent keeps describing could transform into yet another political illusion, one that leaves real economic devastation in its wake. The rare earth element component of this framework agreement is where the actual strategic leverage becomes most apparent. These specialized minerals, form the backbone of virtually all modern technology. They're essential for manufacturing advanced fighter jets, electric vehicles, smartphones, artificial intelligence processors. The list just goes on. And right now, approximately 70% of America's rare earth supply still originates from China. For certain critical elements like scandium and yttrium, that dependence actually reaches 100%. The United States has no alternative suppliers for these specific materials. This is exactly why Bessent pushed Beijing to postpone its planned export restrictions for at least 1 year. It's a brief pause, really, intended to give Washington some breathing room, some time to prepare alternative arrangements. But 1 year isn't much time when you're talking about rebuilding entire supply chains from scratch. Mining operations take years to establish and bring to full production capacity. Refining facilities, honestly, require even longer development timelines. What this temporary delay really provides the United States is an opportunity to engage in what amounts to panic purchasing. Washington and its allies are expected to begin stockpiling rare earth elements at unprecedented levels, attempting to secure enough inventory to maintain industrial production if Chinese supplies are eventually cut off. The fundamental problem runs even deeper than mining, though. China doesn't just extract these materials from the ground, it controls the refining process. Beijing controls approximately 60% of global rare earth mining operations, which is significant. But they control an overwhelming 91% of the world's refining capacity. That gap is enormous and, frankly, strategically decisive. To put that in perspective, Malaysia, which ranks as the world's second largest refiner of rare earth elements, holds only a 4% market share. The distance between China's dominance and everyone else's capabilities is staggering. Closing that gap will require massive investments of time, capital, and technical expertise, resources that the United States currently lacks. New supply agreements are being negotiated and signed across Southeast Asia. Countries like Malaysia, Australia, and Vietnam are all being courted as potential alternative suppliers. But these efforts cannot replace Chinese capacity overnight. Building new mining operations and constructing new refining facilities could easily take 5 to 10 years before they're producing at meaningful scale. So even if China agrees to postpone implementing its export restrictions, Beijing still maintains the upper hand in this relationship. Washington officials might talk publicly about diversification strategies and reducing dependence on Chinese rare earth supplies. But the reality, for now, remains unchanged. The global rare earth lifeline still runs directly through Beijing. And everyone involved in this negotiation knows it. S&P Global recently completed an extensive analysis of approximately 9,000 companies operating worldwide, and what they uncovered reveals the genuine price tag of this ongoing tariff conflict, a staggering $1.2 trillion black hole carved directly into global supply chains. These trade barriers are functioning exactly like hidden taxes embedded throughout the economy. Importing companies now pay substantially more for raw materials and components. Exporting companies watch their profit margins shrink quarter after quarter. And consumers, ordinary people just trying to manage household budgets, end up bearing most of the financial burden. In fact, the research shows that only 1/3 of the total cost is actually absorbed by corporations. The remaining 2/3 falls directly on the public through higher retail prices for everyday goods. The Trump administration repeatedly promised that these tariffs would lead to cheaper consumer goods and stronger domestic industries. But actual price data tells a very different story. Essential everyday items are becoming more expensive, not less. During a recent interview, a journalist confronted Secretary Bessent with specific numbers. Mr. Secretary, coffee prices are up 19% from a year ago. Beef prices have risen almost 15%. Bacon is up almost 6%, just to name a few examples. So when are all grocery prices going to come down, as President Trump promised? Bessent's response was telling. Well, Christine, it's unfortunate. As much as I like you, you like to cherry-pick numbers. So when we came into office, it was all about egg prices. Eggflation, eggflation, eggflation. You know what? Egg prices are down now. Gasoline prices are down. Overall, inflation since President Trump took office has come down. Rather than directly addressing the surge in food costs that millions of Americans face every time they shop for groceries, Bessent dismissed the question as cherry-picking data. But those numbers aren't cherry-picked statistics to the families living with them every single day. The affordability crisis has transitioned from a temporary shock to the new baseline reality. Inflation is squeezing household budgets from every direction simultaneously, and tariffs only intensify that pressure, functioning as a quiet tax on the very people these policies were supposedly designed to protect. By freezing the planned 100% tariff escalation, Washington isn't declaring victory in this economic conflict. Instead, officials are desperately trying to prevent a complete collapse of consumer confidence and spending. This move has far less to do with winning a trade war and much more to do with preventing the domestic economy from tipping into crisis territory. American consumers are already financially stretched to their breaking point, and the latest economic indicators confirm just how precarious the situation has become. Subprime auto loan delinquencies have surged to 6.43%, a level that actually exceeds what was recorded during the 2008 financial crisis. Working families are falling behind on car payments. Credit card debt has reached all-time record highs, and every additional price increase adds more stress to already strained household finances. Now imagine what would have happened if tariffs had suddenly doubled the cost of imported consumer goods. Everyday products at major retailers like Walmart or Target would have become significantly less affordable overnight. Families would have faced impossible choices, buying groceries or keeping up with vehicle loan payments, paying rent or covering credit card minimums. That kind of economic shock would have sent consumer spending, which forms the fundamental backbone of the entire United States economy, into free fall. Retail sales would have collapsed, business revenues would have plummeted, job losses would have accelerated. This is exactly why the administration is so desperate to maintain this framework agreement with China. A full-scale tariff war would obliterate consumer confidence, accelerate inflation beyond control, and send destructive ripples across global financial markets. Bessent's victory lap isn't really about winning. It's about buying time and attempting to stabilize the situation before everything unravels completely. For the moment, both Washington and Beijing are taking a collective breath, pausing their economic battle before it spirals beyond anyone's ability to control. But the underlying structural tensions haven't disappeared. They're still there, still building pressure. This isn't peace. This is a fragile truce barely holding together a global economic system that's already under immense strain from multiple directions. Chinese officials and analysts have been warning for some time now that the world is transitioning into a multipolar era, one where no single nation dominates global trade networks or technological development. Even if this fragile framework manages to survive in the short term, the fundamental divide between Washington and Beijing will continue widening. The semiconductor war continues at full intensity. The race for artificial intelligence supremacy accelerates every month. The global competition for critical resources and materials proceeds at full speed ahead. None of these conflicts have been resolved or even paused. China is actively constructing what it calls a multipolar world order through extensive trade partnerships and massive infrastructure investments across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Meanwhile, America is increasingly turning inward, attempting to shield its economy behind protective tariff walls and domestic subsidy programs. Every agreement reached now, including this framework that Bessent is celebrating, is really just a temporary pause in a much longer contest over economic survival and global influence. So here's the question worth considering. Was this actually a trade victory for the United States? Or are we witnessing something else entirely? America's quiet retreat from its own tariff war, a recognition that escalation would inflict more damage domestically than it would strategically achieve abroad? The answer matters. Because whatever comes next will be shaped by how accurately we understand what just happened. And right now, beneath the optimistic headlines and political spin, the economic foundations look far more fragile than anyone in power wants to acknowledge.